Vanakkam. Ever wondered why rivers running through cities in the global north look like this, while those in the global south look more like this? Why do the biggest garbage dumps and polluting industries seem concentrated in developing countries? This didn't happen by accident or due to a lack of civilization, but rather intentionally. In a leaked memo from 1992, the chief economist of the World Bank, Lawrence Summers, explains the economics behind this. Just between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to least developed countries? A given amount of health impairing pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be the country with the lowest wages. I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. After the memo was leaked, it was defended as something set to provoke discussion within the institution and was soon forgotten after a brief apology. The logic of it, though, is quite tied in the activities of the World Bank. Today, the World Bank is seen as a universal force for good in global health, financing health projects, technical capacity building, and knowledge. Most academic writing you find would also support this. Criticisms of the policies of the World Bank is scarce in both popular media and academia, and often relegated to the pages of alternative World Health reports. Let's investigate. So where did all of this begin? On July 1st, 1944, as the Soviet and Allied armies continued their slow march to Berlin, delegates from 44 countries met at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Most of Europe has faced major devastation during the war, and the conference was meant to outline the plans for monetary and international collaboration. Thus began the process of setting up the economic order that governs most of international relations, including health, to this day. Two institutions were formed at this point. The first was the International Monetary Fund. The IMF was charged with maintaining the system and giving short-term loans to governments experiencing deficits. The second was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which then went on to become the World Bank. The bank was tasked with providing loans for the war-ravaged countries. From their creation, the Bretton Woods institutions had a colonial legacy. The declaration starts with the statement, "This conference at Bretton Woods representing nearly all the peoples of the world." Absent from this list are most countries in Africa and Asia. Just 4 countries represent all of Africa, and one still a British colony. Asia also follows suit, with only 5 countries represented and 4 either colonies or protectorates. The foundational assumption that the formation of these structures was through the consent of nearly all the peoples of the world is flawed. Why is this historical oversight important? Because as the activities of the institutions expanded, this bias is amplified further. This legacy continues in the voting patterns within the World Bank. The international agencies under the mandate of the United Nations are given a single vote per country, but the voting in the World Bank is based on shares held in the bank by the country. The United States has almost 16% of the votes, and with the threshold for passing amendments at 85%, a virtual veto power. The entire continent of Africa, on the other hand, has less than 7%. Every president of the World Bank so far has been an American citizen, nominated by the United States for the position. This is a system of quasi-democracy, where votes of each country are not weighted equally. Low and middle-income countries are left with no way of exerting influence and getting terms that are less harmful to them. Economically, the World Bank initially adopted a model based on Keynesian economics. The model essentially called for a predominant private sector backed by strong government intervention. The bedrock of the bank's actions was development. Since direct colonial rule was now unfashionable, development seemed a convenient way to continue the cycle. I'll explain what I mean by this a little later on. 3 decades later, the framework of colonialism and imperialism was augmented by a third, more dangerous plan, neoliberalism. And then the trickle became a flood. To really understand the effects of the bank, we need to first unpack structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment programs first came into force in the early 1980s. The economic model of most countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa were dependent on state provision of services and control of the market, With multiple financial crises and recession plaguing their economies, they had a hard time paying back their existing debt, most of which were to their previous colonizers. The IMF and the World Bank offered relief from this situation. A fresh series of loans and bailouts if they met the conditions that the Bretton Woods institutions had laid out. The conditions were a reduction of subsidies for basic consumer items, trade and tariff liberalization, reduction in state expenditure, particularly in social sector spending, otherwise known as austerity, and finally, privatization of state enterprises. All the money saved would then be spent on repaying the loan. This macroeconomic restructuring was meant to transform these countries into export-oriented economies. The World Bank and the IMF argued that opening up the economies of these countries and promoting foreign direct investment, along with reducing the role of the state, was the only way to promote growth and development. It should be noted that these assumptions and the importance given to free market capitalism were still economic theories that were being evaluated. It was not the only proven solution to organize the economy. By coupling these conditions with the much needed loans, the bank was able to impose this unproven system on some of the poorest countries of the world. Newly decolonized countries in the global south had no choice but to accept this way of economic organization. In doing this, the bank was able to propagate its own ideologies, placing its power and economic interests along with that of their backers from high-income countries at the forefront of global economic systems. The bank directly helped spread neoliberalism across most of the world, fooling us all into believing that this should be the natural state of things. Now that we got that out of the way, let's see how they ruined health. Structural adjustment programs affected health directly in two ways, through the introduction of user fees and privatization. User fees or user charges are payments that patients needed to make at the point of care of access to health. In most low and middle income countries, the state had provided free healthcare. Two things changed this. The first was a report by the World Bank economist Ferranti in 1985. He challenges the convention that healthcare needs to be provided by the government. The inefficiencies within the current system, inequity in distribution, and the inability of governments to finance their health expenditure were his supporting arguments. He proposed introducing user fees as one of the ways to recuperate this loss of revenue. This call was echoed by the Agenda for Reform published by the World Bank and culminated in the Bamako Initiative. The new system was based on large-scale introduction of user charges in health. The results of this move were arguably marginal at best and downright disastrous at worst. In Zambia, for example, introduction of user fees was followed by a decrease in the attendance of health centers by 33%. In the Caribbean, 1 in 5 people who reported an illness did not access care because of the costs associated with it. In a modeling exercise done in Africa, removal of user fees was simulated to prevent the deaths of 233,000 children under the age of 5. Detrimental health effects such as untreated morbidity, reduced access to care, long-term impoverishment, and the irrational use of drugs were a result of these policies. Over the years, there has been an increasing consensus among international NGOs working in health and other developmental agencies that the introduction of user fees was a bad move. The economic argument is that user fees led to impoverishment of the people. Ethically, as user fees are seen as a regressive model of health financing and puts the most vulnerable at a disadvantage. And if you're pragmatic, the user fees are barely able to raise any money for the health system while being a significant barrier. Even the provisions for exemption of the most vulnerable from paying user fees were not clearly laid out or institutionalized or made effective. All the assumptions that the World Bank made in the introduction of user fees have been proven false. There was no increase in efficiency of healthcare delivery, and it worsened inequities. There was also no demonstrable improvement in the accountability that people had over the health system. By going ahead with this move, the World Bank also changed the way health is perceived, from a fundamental right that the state has to provide to a service that people purchase from the state. With hardly any economic benefit to the state, people from low and middle income countries finally paid the price with their money and their lives. Moving on to privatization. Just a few years before the economists in the World Bank were planning the reforms that countries had to undergo to avail loans, the Declaration of Alma Ata was signed. In an unprecedented show of solidarity towards global health and the understanding of health as a common good, countries from across the world collectively acknowledged the need for better health, this time actually representing nearly all the people of the world. Two aspects of the declaration are important in this context. First, the understanding that it is the state that is responsible for the health of its citizens, and second, the need for a new international economic order, one that is more equitable to bring about this health. Within a decade, both of these points were backtracked on. The underlying economics of structural adjustment mandated that governments of low and middle income countries to reduce their spending on public healthcare by cutting wages, downsizing facilities, and allowing the rapid growth of the private sector in health. This is a tested formula of neoliberalism. First, criminally underfund the public sector and strip it to its bare bones. Then, call out how public provision of healthcare is ineffective. Then, encourage private enterprise to fix said ineffective healthcare. Finally, reap profits in the private sector. An increase in privatization of healthcare has shown to increase inequities in health and lead to an asymmetrical provision of services. The stipulated increase in the quality of services after privatization has also shown to be questionable. There was a slow pulling back of the state from existing health provision and further cutting down on services which are now seen as a private good. This undermined the people's faith in the existing health system and increased dependence on the private sector, which in a deregulated market it's free to set its prices in accordance to market forces. As a result of this, there is a creation of a segmented health system, an underfunded public health system on which the poor and vulnerable have to depend on, and a more modern one where only those who can afford can go. Such a system is simply not equitable. Now we know that there was a possibility of global health moving towards an equitable model as outlined by the Declaration of Alma Ata, but the economic policies of the World Bank undid the effort and collaborations that nations democratically brought together. Health system reform in the name of user charges and privatization has become a norm. To this day, the mandate that states have to ensure the health and well-being of its people is offloaded by the assumption that the private sector will take care of most of it. The loans and structural adjustments of the World Bank affected not only the health but also the determinants of health. There is established evidence to support the relationship between income and health, though the economic arguments of the bank was that its policies were tailored to improve the economic conditions of the receiving countries. Analysis over the decades has proved otherwise. Zambia gives us a good illustration of the negative impacts of implementing structural adjustment programs on the economy. The liberalization of the markets made it easy for cheap foreign goods to flood the market. This caused a fall in the domestic production of the textile market, which was a cornerstone of the local economy. The large level of unemployment created had ripple effects, causing a crisis to worsen. Compare this to India, where the British Empire destroyed the local textile market. The destruction in Zambia was done in a post-colonial setting, with the backing of international economic experts and an international mandate. Direct colonialism was absent, but the end result was the same. This impact on the economy, with local industries being forced to compete in the global market, also had effects in other sectors. For example, the reduction in food subsidies and the reliance on import markets for food has a twin effect of eroding local food security and increasing malnutrition. It also affects the livelihood of people working in agriculture. Though there were economic gains made in some countries, these were distributed asymmetrically, with skilled labor gaining at the expense of all other forms of production. This model of development has also been shown to disproportionately affect certain sections of society, like ethnic minorities, oppressed castes, and women. This effect is compounded by the privatization of healthcare and user charges in public facilities, which made health more inaccessible to the poor and the vulnerable. Education is a strong determinant of health. This plays out in two ways. The first, by increasing the knowledge about health and improving access to health, and secondly, by contributing to the upward economic mobility and the benefits that come with it. Just like the health systems, education in these countries were forced to be restructured to gain loans. The World Bank was instrumental in introduction of user fees for primary education. Reduction in state support for education also meant a degradation of services very similar to health. This directly translated into reduced access to education, disproportionately targeting the poor, vulnerable, and women. The long-term effects of this was the inability of these countries to build up their own technical capacity and strong local institutions that could address the problems of ill health. Structural adjustments specifically call for deregulation of industries and undermine labor rights and labor power. This was achieved through three methods. First, the reduction in public sector spending led to cutting down of secure government jobs. Secondly, they promoted policies of wage reduction and capping minimum wage. The third method was the reformation of pensions and their privatization. These policies came alongside a push to erode the collective bargaining power of workers and decrease the power that unions held. This destabilized the internal labor market, pushing people from stable government jobs to an increasingly unregulated private sector, and rendered unions powerless. The policies were disastrous not just for the people but also for the environment. The call for lessening government control and deregulation have direct impacts on the environment from industries polluting. Removing the incentives for subsistence farming and encouraging the shifting to cash crops for the export market also has detrimental effects on forest cover and groundwater levels. The economic policies causing rapid and unplanned urbanization directly led to an increased pollution, problems with water and sanitation, as well as a risk for climate damage. No wonder those rivers look so different. It's difficult to discern which aspect of these policies have individually caused which negative effect on health, but there is evidence to show that there has been a cumulative and widespread impact on health. An economically weakened society has less power to access education and stable employment. This leads to less chance of organizing and demanding better rights and holding the state accountable. Together, they result in the worsening of healthcare within the conditions of a worsening environment, targeting low and middle income countries in particular and vulnerable populations within them the worst. So what does this mean for global health? From when the bank started financing projects in health and population in the 1970s, it has grown to be an important player in global health, being the largest financier from the United Nations system and the second largest overall. Apart from the direct financial support given to countries, the bank also fills a role as a centralized repository of knowledge. This disproportionate influence on knowledge creation is a double-edged sword. On the plus side, there is an availability of robust, timely, and relevant data from across the world. Most studies quoted in this video itself have baseline data from the World Bank sources. The usefulness of this data for public health research and policy making for countries cannot be overlooked. On the other side, the World Bank has leveraged this position of being a trusted producer of knowledge to push narratives that are favorable to its policies. Remember how I said it's hard to find academic literature critiquing the bank? This is probably why. With the large amount of financial backing and close relationship to the financial ministries of most low and middle income countries, the World Bank is at a prime location for setting the path health policy takes in these countries. This can be seen in the way individual countries have approached their own health in relation to the priorities of the World Bank. The nature of embeddedness the bank has in the otherwise democratic superstructure of global health, the World Health Organization, is also something to note. The understanding of the WHO is that with every country having a vote, decisions and paths that global health takes are roughly reflective of the will of the people. Having an organization like the World Bank embedded deep within its structures with no mechanism of seeking accountability is a cause for concern, especially for countries which have no way of influencing the policies of the bank. The World Bank is also not a kind collector of debts. It has always had the sharp edge of the imperial blade ready for regime change whenever talks of not repaying debt surfaces. Here is Thomas Sankara talking to leaders from Africa about collectively not repaying debt.
Que très sagement, vous nous offriez des solutions. Je voudrais que notre conférence adopte la nécessité de dire clairement que nous ne pouvons pas payer la dette. Non pas dans un esprit belliqueux, belliciste. Ceci pour éviter que nous n'allions individuellement nous faire assassiner. Si le Burkina Faso tout seul refuse de payer la dette, je ne serai pas là à la prochaine conférence. Par contre, avec le soutien de tous, dont j'ai besoin. Avec le soutien de tous, nous pourrons éviter de payer. Et en évitant de payer, nous pourrons à notre développement.
He didn't make it to the next conference and was murdered in cold blood with the help of France and other imperial powers. From its formation, the World Bank has represented the interests of a few countries and select ideologies. The imperialist and the colonial nature has led to worsening of the overall health in low and middle income countries, though individual projects may have helped on a small scale. These economic reforms have also hurt the economy, education, rights and environment of these countries, a lot of which has been acknowledged by the bank itself. The current position it holds, working to further its own ideology without any accountability, will continue to hurt these countries, only in different ways. If we are to move ahead to a better world, the World Bank has to be held accountable for its crimes. For now, I think it's also fair to say that we need to take everything the bank says with a pinch of salt. Or if you're from a country in the global south like me, a pinch of toxic industrial waste. The economic logic of it is impeccable.